Good afternoon, and welcome to the May edition of the GovCon HR Round-Up. My name is Kyle Wade, and I'm the CHRO from GovCon Pay. I'm happy to be filling in this month for my colleague Joe Young, who's normally in this seat, to understand that this is the 5th episode of the podcast.
It is,
That's
yes.
exciting.
Hard to believe.
It's exciting. I've been able to listen to a lot of them, and it's been a lot of great content, so I'm excited about being here today. So I'm here with our partners and co-hosts from the founding partners of Berenzweig, Leonard. We've got Seth Berenzweig, and we have Declan, Leonard, who you've heard from many times on this podcast. But for those of you that are new to just joining today, let's give them a chance to introduce themselves. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Declan Leonard. I'm managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard. I also head up the firm's employment law practice, and I also want to do a shout out to BLC Digital Strategies. That is the studio that we are recording in and presenting this webinar today here in Tysons, and it's actually co-located in our office here in Tysons, Virginia. Todd Castleberry is the president and also the producer of these webinars. So we really appreciate that.
And I'm Seth Berenzweig. I'm a co-managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard, and I lead the corporate and transactional practice. And it's great to be here. This is really one of the hottest topics that's on the plate right now, so really looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, so thanks, guys. Let's get started. Today's topic, as you may have already caught, was affirmative action and DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion. I know personally, I can attest that this topic, as Seth indicated, is much more prevalent and popular these days. Every time I'm on an interview or dealing with an applicant, they're curious. What's your company culture about? What diversity, equity initiatives do you have in place? So this is going to be a great topic today, so we're glad that you're joining us today. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? First question is, so why should federal contractors be rethinking DE&I, and how should they approach the issue of diversity of their employees?
Yeah, when we came up with the topic for today, we use the word rethinking because a lot is changing and has changed with respect to DEI, these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that companies have implemented. And what's really happened over the last couple of years, really culminating with the Supreme Court's decision relating to not federal contractors, and it wasn't even an employment case, but it had to do with Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and their race-based admissions policies that were struck down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically said you can't consider race in admissions anymore. Basically, that alone was discriminatory. You can't have these quotas. And so what has happened since then is there has been a growing tide against anything. So even though that had to do with the issue of education, you can't just say, well, it stops there. It is now spreading to hiring practices. Companies are being scrutinized for these DEI policies, and frankly, some of them are even getting sued. Seth, we follow these, we track these cases. Law firms are certainly not immune from this. King & Spalding, a very, very large mega law firm, national law firm, a female Caucasian attorney wanted to apply to their summer associate program. For those of you who don't know, summer associate programs are the way attorneys get hired generally. And it was only open to people from ethnically or culturally diverse backgrounds, or if they were members of the LGBT community. And she did not consider herself a member of either one of those. And so she was not even eligible to apply to it. And so, she sued. And that case is still winding its way through the courts, but the EEOC actually came out and said that there was probable cause or reasonable cause to allow this case to go forward. And then I'll touch on one other one, a very high-profile case. A white male employee for Novant Health apparently had a great track record there, was a great employee, great performance reviews. he ended up just getting fired and replaced by an African-American manager. He sued. It was Novon Health. He sued because what he found out is that the company publicly announced that they wanted to remake the workplace until it mirrored the community, and they actually paid what they called race-based bonuses for managers who did make these hires. He won a boatload of money. He won $3 million in compensatory damages for lost pay, and it also, the company got hit with major punitive damages. Those ended up getting reversed on appeal, by the judge, but still a multi-million-dollar verdict. We see, companies are shying away from this.
I thought the Duval case was particularly interesting because not only was the plaintiff in that case a white male replaced by a black female, and again, some might say, was that the end of the case? Why was there a multi-million-dollar verdict based upon that? But there was other evidence in the case. Historically, the black male supervisor at one time had 7 white male direct reports. However, during the time that the company was implementing its DEI policy, that dropped down to 0. So there was a lot of evidence in the background in that case that really showed the, quite frankly, some would argue, the potential danger of DEI. The policies and the intention behind DEI are very well intentioned, of course, but you could look at that and really question and think that really DEI right now is really eating its own tail. It's at a point where there is a backlash. There are some decisions that are made, and it applies in different industries. If you take a look, for example, at the so-called Rooney Rule in the NFL, that's something that's been in place for a few decades now. It originated from one of the owners in Pittsburgh, and it not long ago ended up in a lawsuit by one of the former coaches for the Miami Dolphins that said that he was really just given kind of token service or just disrespect.
He was just being brought in for interviews. The Rooney Rule basically says what? You have to offer.
You have to interview.
You have to interview minority candidates as part of a coaching selection process.
Not less than one, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so he was basically saying he was getting so many interviews. What he wasn't getting was job offers.
Exactly.
As a result of those. And so he basically said, look, this is a system that's set up. It's a Pyrrhic system. It's not even, it's not, nobody's bringing me in. They're bringing me in to check boxes. They're not bringing me in on my merits.
So you look at it and then you ask yourself, in the NFL and frankly in other companies, is this working? There was a study that I read recently that said that publicly traded companies that follow DEI policies do not provide higher rates of shareholder return than any other company. And I'm not trying to be cynical about it. They don't just plug in DEI to just try to make shareholders more money, but it's just one of the many metrics and measures to see whether this is something that is working or whether it really needs to be reconsidered.
There are a lot of companies, very well-known companies, that are, as we titled this, Rethinking DEI. Again, not the underlying policies of really just trying to get the best and the brightest from as many different applicant pools as possible, which I believe is the true aim of all of this, and it's a very laudable goal. But the way that it has been implemented, as we'll talk about a little bit more today, is just really just trying to get a numbers game, and at the expense of hiring always the best and the brightest. That needs to be the goal. It should still never replace a meritocracy, but it should expand who is being considered for that meritocracy.
And it shouldn't supplant training. If you really want to promote people from within, you should provide more opportunities for networking, training, certification. Those are the sorts of things that would help lay a more successful foundation rather than just, plugging and blocking quotas.
For sure. Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of these topics here as we progress today. But let me throw another question out for you both today then. But because sometimes there's some confusion. Don't federal contractors have to have affirmative action plans? Sometimes people confuse DE&I initiatives with affirmative action plans, but what's the answer there?
Sure. So government contractors with 50 or more employees have to have an affirmative action plan in writing, and in fact, there's an upcoming deadline in this regard. The OFCCP has benchmarked a July 1st deadline for government contractors, qualified government contractors, to submit their affirmative action plan in writing to the agency. And the agency's also set a benchmark of 5.2% for the federal contractors to have a workforce inclusive of veterans. So it is true that if you're a government contractor with 50 more employees, you have different and frankly additional regulatory requirements that are layered on top of all the other general provisions and requirements. However, what this does do is it could put government contractors a little bit more in the firing line, because when we see from instances like the Duval case, it has to be done in a very thoughtful manner and to make sure that this is something that promotes merit-based promotions in the company rather than trying to rigidly, throw people into quotas. So it's something that government contractors need to be aware of, particularly in light of the fact that a lot of these cases that we're talking about today have really just come out within the last few weeks, if not literally within the last few days.
Sure.
And it's important to know that. So you're right that you've got the veteran OFCCP saying that listen, veterans comprise 5.2% of the relevant labor population, and so they don't call it a quota though; they call it a benchmark. And it's. Sometimes I feel bad for contractors because they get these terms and it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Is it a benchmark? Is it a quota? They very specifically use the word benchmark, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as the conversation progresses. But benchmarks should not, whether or not somebody would ever confuse them for quotas. It's our belief that contractors should not confuse benchmarks with quotas. It is really, benchmarks are really along the lines of being aware of data in the relevant industry and trying to comprise hiring policies that will help you, again, expand the relevant labor pool, so that chances are the more expansive your labor pool is, the more you're going to get to these benchmarks of, let's say, 5.2% of veterans.
Yeah, I think the thing that you just mentioned is one of the most important points of the day. The labor pool is critical, and arguably I could argue it's more important than the final selection, because if you have a well-qualified labor pool where people are treated in an equal and level and fair manner, that's going to be the most important thing. Giving people opportunities within a pool to then be able to be promoted on a merit-based system is going to be best for the employees, it's going to be best for the company, it's going to be best for the customer. So I think that distinction is an important one there.
Yeah, I give the example of like Silicon Valley. If you've ever been out to the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, where of course so much of the tech hub is, and AI hub, and so many other industries that are the hot industries emanate from Silicon Valley. You've got Stanford University there. If you only sought to hire from that general area of, I guess, Palo Alto, just around there. If you only really sought to hire, and the one school you always went to for your internship program was Stanford University, that's a great example of, to me, where DEI could come into play. Because if you just narrow it to this small little area, you're going to get a very homogenous workplace. You just are. I mean, it attracts a very homogenous group. Stanford University is going to attract a largely homogenous group too. So what companies in Silicon Valley, so let's just say we're advising one of them about how to really, really not put quotas into place, but how to really expand their labor pool. They need to go way beyond just Silicon Valley. Like they need to go to many different parts of the country, and that will draw on a much larger labor pool. And then when they're looking at applicants, they still have to hire based on meritocracy. They should not be taken into account any of these characteristics like race or gender, because flat out it's discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court said it is, and candidly, it's pretty much common sense that if you're taking that into account at the expense of somebody else's immutable characteristic, it's discrimination, and it's hard to say it's not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I can tell you, certainly if you're a GovCon client or government contractor listening and you're approaching that 50 employee mark, if you're not already thinking about affirmative action plans, you should be. You'd be surprised. I run into clients that are sort of north of 50 employees, and they're like, what? What's an affirmative action plan?
Or what's the OFCCP?
Yeah, so,
yes. I have to look that up sometimes too. And it's important to know that 50 or more employee, that is only where the requirement comes into play that the AAP, the affirmative action plan, be in writing. all federal contractors really are supposed to have an affirmative action plan. It just doesn't have to be in writing. You don't have to certify it to the OFCCP until you get to 50 or more employees. So it's not like you can totally keep it out of mind or disregard it. Exactly.
I think companies in these cases could really find themselves at risk on the flip sides of the same coin. On the one hand, they could be asked in a discrimination case whether they have a program and whether they really followed it. But on the other hand, if they really followed it, but they didn't follow it correctly or take into some of the considerations that we're mentioning today, then it can be used as a weapon instead of a shield.
Sure.
So you have to make sure that not only do you have the right plans, but that you have the right strategy in mind.
Agreed. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving, gentlemen. Let's move on to the next question. So, how should contractors balance the tide against DE&I with these other requirements to have a more diverse workplace? That's a big question that clients are running into these days.
Yeah, I think what they have to realize is affirmative action applies to all. You can't just pick certain races, a gender over another gender. You've got to understand that really the goal of affirmative action is to outlaw discrimination in the hiring process. By the way, it doesn't just apply to the hiring process. It's pay, promotion, all of those different things. In your world with GovCon Pay, it's developing compensation plans that don't discriminate against anybody, whether it's minorities, whether it's whites, whether it's males, whether it's females, So that's one thing. Quotas are just never allowed. If you have a quota, if you have a disguised quota, you're susceptible to litigation no matter what. We already talked a little bit about benchmarks and quotas and how they're different. I think the key, and again, we're a little bit of a broken record, but I think companies forget this. The goal is to expand the relevant labor force. You still want to hire the most qualified applicant, whether that's a minority or not. And so a couple of ways to do that. Okay, so don't just post. We talked about the Silicon Valley example where you're just in your little bubble and you're just continuing to hire from this, certain square mileage around headquarters of, whatever hot AI company is coming out. That's not the way to practice good hiring. You've got to expand it. Don't just post your job postings on just the typical job boards. It's easy to do sometimes. You go for the tried and true, but you got to branch out. Things like partnering with universities in different parts of the country, partnering with HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, other community groups. What you're trying to do is expand the reach of applicants. There's so many qualified people out there, and if you're just limiting yourself to this little bubble, it's not going to work out.
Well, the career service centers in each of those institutions would be a great place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because one of their things that they're specifically modeled on is to try to have coordinated relationships with potential employers, and then they could help the company as well. So that's an excellent and very specific implementable idea.
How about training and internships and apprenticeship?
Yeah.
How do you think that could be implemented to help expand the relevant labor pool?
Well, I would look at the industry and see what kinds of certifications would be helpful for the advancement of each individual's professional plan. Certainly software engineers have different kinds of certifications rather than electrical engineers, but looking at educational programs and certifications based upon a person's skill set and their career goals is one example, as well as continuing education. These are programs that today are even more accessible with remote learning. So the benefit cost analysis of that is really divergent and really in favor of the company, of the employer and the employee, and that would really help them get a continually qualified workforce.
You raise a good point, because if you wait until the job is being posted and then you look to see who's the relevant skill, who matches the relevant skill set.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, so this notion of training is really a key one, because what you're doing is because let's face it, not everybody in this country has the same opportunities, and so for certain minorities, and that's economic minority, disadvantage, all kinds, they might not have the same training coming into a job as others. But if they got that training, they might be
Yeah.
excellent employees. I mean, again, the goal is to be excellent employees. You do nobody a favor putting them in a job just to fill some kind of a quota. It's not going to help the company, and candidly, it's the most unfair thing you could do to that applicant.
Well, I would argue that companies and corporate America would really be taking a major lead in terms of the education of the workforce, even arguably beyond what some of the universities are doing. Some of the universities have 5, 4, 3% acceptance rates where they're not expanding their pool.
Yeah.
They're taking in more money, but they're also accepting in less students. The employers, in many instances, are at the lead of implementing more helpful changes to the workforce and in the corporate American culture. So this is an opportunity. I think the idea of mentoring and training is something that's really one of the key takeaways here.
And I'll throw out one more just before we move on, which is remote work. You know, COVID obviously sort of expanded on steroids this notion. So many companies, Kyle, we were talking before, you all have largely gone, you know, remote, you know. And so what remote does is it allows your applicant pool to be nationwide, sometimes even
right.
international. And so again, back to my Silicon Valley example, you can just, you know, you can hire somebody in disadvantaged parts of the country where you're going to get, you know, you're going to by definition get some diversity. And when I say diversity, I don't necessarily mean based on an immutable characteristic. I mean people who have economic diversity, you know, people who live in Appalachia, people who live in certain parts of, you know, Kentucky, Louisville, all these places. You can start to hire the best and the brightest in those places, and if that's the very definition, in my opinion, of diversity.
Well, it is, and I'll tell you a couple of quick points before we move on. One
Yeah.
is we see a lot of organizations. Some now have gone to their hiring process. They've started reviewing resumes without looking at the person's name, or they make sure they're not looking at their college degree or where they came from or what their level of education is. Some organizations are thinking about whether or not they truly need a college degree for some of their positions. But the point you touched on earlier, which is the key, is you want to cast a wide net as possible when you're out there trying to find people. That is one of the biggest takeaways we've seen with some of the affirmative action plans is you have opportunities here, and some of the topics that you all just touched on are always some of those initiatives or those actionable items that clients then try and implement to try and do that, try and cast a wider net and see if they can do a better job.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked about resume sifting. It's a great segue to the next topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So next question is, how is the latest AI craze impacting DE&I with government contractors?
Well, this is really one of my favorite topics because AI is something that is ever shifting and ever progressing. And along the lines of what you mentioned a moment ago, sifting through a huge pile of resumes seems to be an ideal opportunity to just crank it, you know, and sprinkle some AI dust on it and then see what comes out at the back end. And it's not uncommon for most federal contractors to consider using some form of AI when sifting through resumes. But there have been instances, including some very recent litigation developments, that demonstrates that when you mix AI with DEI, it ends up with kind of an OMG moment. I just made that up.
WTF.
Okay.
Not bad, not bad. So there's a case out of San Francisco from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California, Mobley versus Workday. And in this case,
Workday is a very popular AI platform for employment.
Exactly. Derek Mobley was he's a black male over the age of 40 that relied upon the Workday AI platform to apply for jobs, and he was rejected over 100 times. He filed a lawsuit in California alleging discrimination. And there are two kinds of discrimination, and I promise not to get you lost in the weeds, but there's disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment is intentional discrimination, and disparate impact is a practice or program that, although not having a discriminatory intent, has a disproportionate effect upon individuals of a protected class. This is a disparate impact case because what he said in the case is that there was a disparate impact on people of color as a result of plugging the AI program into the job search discharge protocols. And after going through some back and forth in litigation, long story short, the judge ruled that this software platform constitutes an employment agency covered by Title VII. And what that means is that a software program has now been deemed to basically run as a capacity as an employer for purposes of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And what that also means is that when a company uses this kind of a program, and that program could be marred with this kind of a disparate impact black eye, it's obviously going to have a flow-down effect on the interview process. So this Mobley case is something that is absolutely not going to be the last of its kind,
Sure.
but it shows that over-reliance on AI models can result in a disparate impact claim in the world of discrimination, and it's something that we've certainly seen. We're really in the first or second inning of this as far as the legal claims are concerned,
Right.
but it really is a very important development.
And keep in mind, the company is not going to be able to escape liability here by saying, well, yeah, but we use Workday. Everyone uses Workday. That's a tried and true.
Everybody does it.
Yeah, everybody
Right.
does it. And,
Right.
and by the way, we know nothing about technology. We don't know what Workday's algorithm is. In fact, it's a highly protected trade secret, so we would never
didn't
be able
write
to.
it. Yeah.
It's not going to be enough. You're going to be, I suspect what's going to happen is it's Workday plus the companies that they were applying for, they're both going to be considered almost like joint employers for purposes of liability. So
Yeah.
you can't just outsource the process.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to be if you're a company out there, federal contractor, and you're using these AI platforms, you can't just outsource it. You have to be vigilant about knowing what's happening.
Yep.
Just be aware of your hiring statistics. It's kind of like getting back to the phrase benchmarking. Be aware of your hiring practices. See who's coming in, and does it look like my labor pool has been expanded enough to really get the best and brightest from as far as we can.
Yeah, scan the data. Just understand, what you're working with. Don't just completely take the lead from a machine.
Yeah.
And the more that you can just stay on top of the process, the more you'll be able to root out these kinds of problems.
Well, Workday is certainly not the only organization that's implementing AI. I mean, I'm seeing it a lot with a lot of different applicant tracking systems and a lot of different HCM platforms. So there's not a SHRM event or a conference that I go to where AI is not on the agenda.
Yeah.
So it is popular. It is here to stay. So take a look. Make sure you're thoughtful about what you're implementing, that you have some policies in place.
Yeah.
And as a help for that, for the contractors out there, the OFCCP, and again, I know we've talked a lot about the OFCCP, it stands for the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. You probably know this acronym pretty well if you're in this space. They recently released a guide, and it's titled Artificial Intelligence and Equal Employment Opportunity for Federal Contractors. I suggest you look that up. If anyone needs a link to it, we're happy to provide it. But again, it's Artificial Intelligence and Equal Employment Opportunity for federal contractors. A lot of good information there, touching on the sticking points that we're talking about here.
Great.
So we got probably time for one more.
One more question here. So Declan, let me give this one to you. What other DE&I initiatives or related issues beyond employee hiring, which we've talked a lot about, should federal contractors be on the lookout for?
Man, it's a beautiful sunny day out there, and I feel like I'm just nothing but bad news and rain clouds with my discussion here. So here's what I'm just going to leave you all with. I think that this is going to continue. It started with higher education. I think it's going to continue in the hiring process. I think what we're also going to see, and we're starting to see a little bit of it, is the various set-aside programs for federal contractors where there are presumptions of disadvantage as opposed to whether it's economically or socially.
Like the 8A program.
Like the 8A program. So this is already starting. There was
It's
a case,
coming.
a Texas federal judge recently found that a federal contracting program that used a presumption that certain race groups are economically and socially disadvantaged it violates the Equal Protection Clause. The judge made a comment in there that Oprah Winfrey would qualify presumptively as either economically or socially disadvantaged because of her being an African American without any analysis of her own individual condition. And so I think that's what we're going to find now. We're already seeing it with the 8A, with the certification program becoming a lot more strenuous, and you actually having to show disadvantage versus the presumption that existed up until now. I think that that's going to be you see some rumblings on Capitol Hill. People are starting to take note of these programs where presumptive preference is being given to certain minority groups.
Yeah, stay tuned. It's definitely a trend.
Yes. Any happy news to, Joe? I mean, meanwhile, we're talking here. Joe Young is usually, joining us from GovCon Pay.
He's having fun.
Lord knows he's probably in a great location. I mean, doing great work, too.
New Orleans,
Yeah.
He's in New Orleans right now. Yeah.
Just because he's drinking now doesn't mean he's not getting any work done.
That's right.
That guy is a workhorse, trust me. Well, fantastic.
Okay. Well, do we have time for any questions? Or
I think we are at our quota.
At our quota,
We're at
okay.
our quota. I just said it.
All right.
We were trying to benchmark 30 minutes, and now we're right at a quota.
Perfect. Okay. Well, then on behalf of Seth and Declan, I'd like to thank everybody for carving a little bit of time out of your day today to join us. We hope that you'll join us again next month. The date is June 20th, so go ahead and mark your calendars. The topic's going to be, which is another hot topic that just I think you all touched on it last time even, is that the future of non-compete agreements with the new rules that broke out from the FTC. So June 20th is the next podcast. Mark your calendars. Make sure that you can attend. And we certainly look forward to having you there and appreciate your time today. Gentlemen?
Kyle, great joining you, and thank you, everyone, for listening.